Hi there, welcome back to Books for Believers. We are pleased to welcome you here, and we have a very exciting book to look at today called Almond from a South Korean author about whom you've got a lot to learn if you don't already know her. And so join us as we talk about this very special novel about human circumstances that are so frequently overlooked in our modern worldview and society. Welcome to Books for Believers. We're glad you're here.
All right, well, welcome to this episode of Books for Believers. As Brad mentioned, we're talking about the book Almond by Pyung. Won Pyung Sun. This episode, and it's a book that really uh, took Korea by surprise back in 2017. Became almost immediately one of the most popular books in the country of that decade, and for good reason. There were all sorts of pictures and reports of famous people reading the book, and of course, that makes the plebs read the book as well. And in 2020, it was translated into English and has been a popular book in English as well. The book is called Almond, and it deals with some very important themes, understanding grief and healing and the need for human connection. And while this is a secular work, it touches on a lot of themes that we as Christians deal with, and we as Christians are uniquely able to deal with because of the intersection of spiritual life and healing for these human nature problems. And so it's a wonderful book, an expose on two boys who find themselves on the opposite side of emotion and are able to balance each other out, the need for human connection. And It's a wonderful book. Uh, I'll read actually the intro. It's just a few lines, and then I'll hand it off to Brad to give a little overview of the book. So the intro reads, I have almonds inside me, and so do you. So do those you love and those you hate. No one can feel them. You just know they're there. This story is, in short, about a monster meeting another monster. One of those monsters is me. This line had me hooked from the very beginning, and it doesn't fail to deliver through the entire book. So, Brad, I'll hand it off to
Yeah.
you.
So the fun thing about this book is that it comes from South Korea, which is interesting because when we meet translated works, like in the past, we've looked at works that come from, Spanish-speaking backgrounds in South America. So we notice that there's cultural differences, but they're all Romance languages. So it's really an easy lift, even though it can be done well or poorly, right? When it comes to translating from a Korean background, there's so much difference in the nature of language itself, and we need to talk at least a little bit about that because it's critical to, I think, understanding why this book is important and how you can connect with it, and maybe why it'll feel a little bit foreign to you in spite of the fact that it just is foreign. So when it comes to Korean language, we have to note that it is different from English in a lot of ways, but probably the most pronounced and noticeable way that it's different from English is the way in which honorifics are included in the language. And so the way that you would address a person differs based upon who you are and who they are. And that means that it is impossible to translate a work from Korean to English without being horrifyingly clunky or oddly vague, right?
Mhm.
So it's interesting that both Dane and I have, quite a few years of time involved in living in Korea and involved in thinking about and engaging with Korean culture and language. So some of that comes naturally, but if you're reading this without that understanding, just recognize that there's a lot of kind of subtext playing into the relationships that come from that Eastern worldview of essentially Confucianism and Taoism that build a world based upon, are you older than me? Are you my father's older brother's child? Okay, well then even if I'm older than you, then that changes the dynamic and the standing. So all of these things kind of play in, and I would encourage you to, one, appreciate that as if you're going to read it, or if you haven't already, if you have, and then also come to an appreciation for how beautifully this is translated in spite of those difficulties. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dane?
No, I think the translation of this work really was masterful, and well, I'm glad that they took 3 years to translate it. They got a wonderful translator for it, and he was uniquely able um, to bring through the feel of the Korean language in its short, pithy statements into the English. And the adoption of Korean honorifics, as you brought up, but just Korean culture was very naturally woven in, where you get kind of like in the Gospel of Mark, for example, some explanation of the culture that might not have been relevant or necessary in the Korean. But in working your way through this book, you feel as if you've been brought into that culture a bit. You're familiar with some characters, some people who have grown up in a Korean mindset with this Korean idea of social hierarchy and their place as children in this book, because both of the main character, all three of the main characters, I guess, here are youths. And youth culture in Korea is, I would argue, a lot stronger than youth culture in America. America is a lot more balanced towards middle-aged individuals. In Korea, there's a lot of emphasis on childhood, children, and they're growing into adults. And so it comes through strongly in this book.
Mm. Along with the reality that you have to recognize that in Korea, there is no diversity. That's part of the thing that keeps American society sort of on the hop, is because when you're talking about what it means to be a teen, you're kind of talking about what does it mean to be a teen in LA versus Arizona versus New York or Colorado, whatever it is, and then what does it mean to be a teen of this socioeconomic group and ethnic group or language group, right? It's difficult to unite, but all the Koreans are Korean. Not to say that there aren't minority groups there, but they're excluded entirely. Having lived there, you're excluded entirely from society. You're welcomed, but only as a guest. You'll never be Korean. And what that means is that for books like this, you have to recognize that the characters grow up in a very confined and safe, if you would want to say, world wherein you're growing up as as Korean in Korea, right? Language, social expectations, schooling, everything hits different. And that's why this is such a fun, one of the reasons why this is such a fun book to read, because it effortlessly gives you that understanding as long as you're available to see it, right? It's a wildly different worldview of what it means to grow up, because it's so distinct from the way that we grow up. Even the fact that he's growing up, the main character is growing up without a father figure around, and the particular amount of discomfort and shame that is associated with that is just subtly woven in. You'd never see, right? Because we've been telling the story about the heroic single mom and how a great a way that is to grow up, right, in America. Well, that's not been there. Not having a father around, or being born out of wedlock, or even the accusation of that, is still sort of a shameful thing that you wouldn't want to have, and it plays into every aspect of this, being raised by a mother and a grandmother, as our main character is.
Mhm.
So,
Well, that tees us up well to launch into the unique situation that Yoon-jae, the main character, finds himself in, because he's in this closed society of Korea where the social expectation of every individual is understood and universally known. And yet Yoon-jae finds himself as an asa in an insa culture where insa means insider, asa is an outsider, where everything should lead him to be an insider. He finds himself on the outside of society because of this unique condition that he has, alexithymia, which is a shrinkage in the amygdala to where he's not able to process emotion. His body's not able to jive with his soul or his thoughts in expressing this emotion naturally. And so he's got to learn to mimic emotion based on social cues. Um, all Koreans are very aware of social cues. In fact, they call it nunchi, where if you have nunchi, that means you're able to adapt to a situation, you're able to fit in well, you're able to follow the social cues, and you don't stand out. Yoonjae's main goal in life is simply not to stand out, because if he stands out in this culture, the result of that is incessant bullying. teasing him for not crying at the right moments, or teasing him for not caring when people are upsetting him or should be upsetting him. He walks through life with essentially a stone face, and it upsets a lot more people than it probably should. Uh, but uh, uh, one of the main catalysts here in the story is when he meets a very emotional young boy named Gun. Now, Yunjae means governed strength or governed talent rather, where we get the sense of this boy. He's got a lot of restraints on him, but there's some burgeoning talent within him. But then Gun means strength, and we've got this very strong young man who kind of attaches himself to Yunjae, despite Yunjae's desires to have anyone attached to him or let anyone close to him. And Goon essentially decides he's going to teach Yunjae how to feel. And it becomes quite a beautiful story of two young boys who are anything but beautiful in the conventional sense.
Right. And it is amazing how engaging it is because it's told from that first person perspective. So you're introduced to life in a very sympathetic way through the main character, Yunjae, and just really appreciating the struggle to deal with a problem that you would ordinarily deal with through feeling, right? So it's not just that he doesn't feel well and or feel like everybody else or have that same sense experience and is thus rejected for it, but he also has to figure out it doesn't feel bad to be rejected.
Mhm.
Like the only thing that can key him off is that it would make his mother upset, and so his mother and grandmother's training combined with the catastrophic effects. So you have this wonderful account in the middle where because he's so deadpan and so emotionless, he goes and finds a hurting body in the alley, and then goes over to the shopkeeper right next door and says, "There's a dead guy in your alley."
Mhm.
And the shopkeeper goes, "Yeah, just get out of here, kid. Stop goofing with me." And of course, comes to find out that that was actually his son. There was time to save him, but because of his dysfunction and
Mhm.
not being able to convey the urgency of it, and the kid died. Right, the shop owner's kid died. So he comes to find out that his disability has incredible consequences if he can't figure out how to work with it, and yet. And so he's not uncaring, he's not unloving, he's not, disconnected from that, but it's just a masterwork
Mhm.
in in putting yourself or the author putting herself in the shoes of another person so that we can understand the gravity of what it would mean to have to undergo this difficulty.
Yeah. But I think that's perhaps one place where Son's worldview is perhaps a little disconnected from reality, but nonetheless, she's observing reality and situations that could be very real. Someone who's truly unfeeling and unloving and uncaring wouldn't bother going to the shopkeeper and alerting him to the situation.
Right.
Problem is that his body doesn't feel the right experience. And that I think really is what this book goes on to show is that these emotions are there, they're just not expressed properly. It's that disconnect between the body and the soul where we see this young boy has a tender soul, but his body just doesn't feel it with the chemicals running through it. And so the issue is, I think, finding a workaround for that rather than trying to view the uh, the chemicals running through the body as the cause and the actual inciting incident of an emotion, realizing that these are just an expression of the emotion that the person already has. Without fixing the amygdala, otherwise, there would be no way to bring Yunjae to an emotional response.
Hmm.
Yet this book accomplishes an emotional response finally in Yunjae, apart from the chemicals in his body.
And he's so well complemented by Gon, and Gon is sort of a kid who's had a rough past, I guess we'll say. He's been raised in what would amount to foster homes. He's been a disciplinary issue in every sense of the word: rebellious, obnoxious, got in with the wrong crowd, rude to people, bullies. He is a scumbag for all intents and purposes. And it seems so early on like he chooses, of course, who all bullies would choose, the most abnormal and defenseless person to pick on. So you're kind of bracing yourself as the reader for, like, this is just going to go poorly. You got the kid with no impulse control, who's a total jerk, and he's given plot motive to hate Yoon-jae. Right? So it's just such a powerful image of something very familiar to us across any culture, and yet also is a beautiful way to introduce them to one another. And you're very quickly given an intuition, an intuitive understanding, again, because of the artfulness of the writing, that maybe Gon isn't as bad as you would have thought based upon all of these features. So what did you think about the early interactions of Gon and Yeonjae?
I was immediately drawn in to both of these boys, honestly, because of students that I had in Korea, and realizing that Sohn really has her thumb on the heartbeat of the youth in Korea. And while every individual is unique, at the same time, there are patterns that you can see in childhood development. And recognizing that, I mean, most likely there's not an amygdala problem with most of these boys, and yet this is just an exaggeration of a problem so that we can see it in a clearer light, where really the disconnect of how to deal with um, these these opposing forces of social expectations versus the emotions that you're feeling. How do you deal with those as you're growing up as a child in Korea with very little leeway in most ways and very little help in dealing with raging emotions? Especially Goon, I had students like this kid,
Oh
and
yeah.
they
Oh yeah.
just want to poke the bear and they want to get a reaction. And how frustrating it is for Goon that he cannot elicit a reaction from Yoonjae. But it makes Yoonjae so much more interesting to him.
Hmm.
And he starts to essentially study Yoonjae, trying to find a way to get him to react. And he's always searching for this negative reaction. And I think it's just beautiful storytelling where Son was able to bring it to, rather than a negative reaction, a a reaction of such self-sacrificial love for Goon, uh, that it's really a story with a lot of redemption in it. You've got miserable people who who genuinely care for each other when the rest of the world seems to not care for them, and when they seem to not care for anyone else. These two that anyone would probably write off as lost causes are able to help one another. And I think we see that ourselves in Christian ministry as well. It's often the individuals that have been written off by others who find themselves most realizing their need for help and most searching for for some way to express their their emotions and looking for a healthy way to do that. And then there are those who seek unhealthy ways to do that, and and it can be detrimental to their lives and to their spirituality.
Mm. Well, and I think also one of the huge challenges that Christianity has undergone is how do we deal with our emotional reality, or the emotional, dimension of our being? Do we completely subjugate it and say my feelings or my emotions are meaningless? I'm just going to live according to the faith, according to what God said, or whatever, and I'm going to subjugate all my feelings, all my desires, rather than dealing with them and become a non-emotional person. In other words, the emotions are the enemy picture. And I think that this book provides an excellent platform to talk about that, because you have the person who is damaged because they're unable to process emotions. He has them, as we said, but he just can't process them. And then you have the person who's damaged because he's entirely controlled by his emotions, right? So the double, or the back and forth of these things is just tremendous for us to think about when it comes to our faith and life. Is it an over emotionalism or an under emotionalism that causes the problem? But the idea of demonizing emotions altogether or glorifying them altogether actually perpetuates precisely those conditions.
Mhm. Well, and I think it's beautiful that the emotion that finally breaks the shell is love. And
Mm,
as sappy as that sounds, and as perhaps cliche as it might be, she never honestly says it in the book, but she shows you and demonstrates that the kind of love she demonstrates is very unique. It's selfless love. It's love for another person at the expense of one's own personal comfort and even one's own personal safety. And while this seems like just a normal literary trope, it's actually a very unique thing in the world to find. And I think it points to something, of course, beyond the chemicals, beyond the natural emotions of man, into something that really we only see in its pure form in the gospel. And
mm,
that's self-sacrificial love of Christ for sinful mankind. We see these two boys that are utterly unlovable.
mm,
And yet, they're able to express selfless love for each other. And this doesn't emanate with themselves, it doesn't start with them. I don't think Sohn understands this, but that love that she's tapped into with these boys is rooted in the divine. It's rooted in God. And that's the only way we're able to experience it. And I think that's one reason why it was so natural that these unfeeling boys or overly emotional boys are are even able to care for each other.
Well, and nowhere in the book is this more clear than in the butterfly incident. Those who have read it will already know this because it's one of the most powerful moments in the book, although almost in a sneaky way. It creeps up on you. I know you're dying to talk about the butterfly incident, so I think you should lead off on this one.
Oh. It was the moment I started to love Goon.
Hmm.
And I think it's probably the moment that anyone who's associated with PETA starts to hate Goon. Uh, but this boy recognizes Yoon-jae's problem. He recognizes what he's missing out on and what he's lost. And in an effort to try to elicit some emotional response from him or reaction, he essentially decimates a butterfly while Yoon-jae sits there watching.
He
And
vivisects it.
he vivisects it,
Yeah, he
yes.
cuts it apart piece by
And off
piece.
this butterfly. And as the reader, you're sitting there positively horrified. And you're looking at both of these boys as just cruel, awful individuals. But then Goon loses it. He can't handle it. And you realize just how tender his heart is
Hmm.
and how much he cares for this kid who you think nobody cares for. And as you've seen this, everyone who has cared for the kid is gone and he's left in the world just untethered. And you're honestly just kind of expecting him to die alone, probably an early death. And here comes Goon. And by this act of cruelty to this butterfly, but the emotional response, you realize how much he values Yunjae. Uh, and I think it's perhaps the first time that Goon realizes how much he values Yunjae. And that seems to be the first spark in Yunjae as well. And that point where things start to change, where he starts to see somebody cares for him and understand what that feels like.
Mm. When I love the author's choice to just to make it a butterfly, like this
Mhm.
thing that is absolutely defenseless. There's no negative part that I know of about a butterfly. They're beautiful, they're harmless, we smile when we see them, we never pull back when they land on our arm or our shoulder. In fact, we feel like we might be lucky or blessed. And so to choose that symbol of harmlessness and beauty as the instrument of destruction that he's trying to get Yunjae to feel and to sympathize with, right? To be able to say that I don't want that beautiful harmless thing destroyed is a really powerful image. Like you said, it's enough to almost turn your stomach, as much as there are quite a few scenes in this book that will turn your stomach for very good reason. I think that's an important point. You know, when we look at the use of violence in literature or something like that, things that's unsettling, I think it's important that we recognize that sometimes those devices can be used just to manipulate, which is hilarious. Because that's kind of how Goon works, right? He's been using various inappropriate acts to manipulate others to get a reaction out of them because of the emptiness of his soul. That's why most movies, books employ these things. They're just trying to manipulate, trying to get a reaction out of people. But great works of literature like Almond use those with a thematic purpose to try to draw us into that universal understanding that what God created is beautiful and valuable, and that we ought not relate to it in a way that is senselessly destructive or selfish, right? So it's a impressive scene to me on so many levels. And I
Mhm.
love what it does in both of them, both of our characters, both Goon and Yunjae, because that's the moment of real transformation. That's where things start to flip, and Goon starts to realize that Yunjae is not an unfeeling monster. It's just isn't able to express. And Yunjae starts to realize, wow, Goon's not a tough guy.
Mhm.
Goon is emotionally broken. He's
Mhm.
crushed. He's looking for any kind of love or sense of beauty or anything that he is to make a positive spin, even though everything that he's done is negative because he viewed himself as being incapable of achieving those goals.
He doesn't know how to relate to the world except through violence and manipulation. That's what he's been shown. And I think Yoonjae delivers for Goon a sense of purity, while Goon delivers for Yoonjae a sense of emotion and caring, um, unexpectedly for both of them. You could almost say as as Goon lays bare this butterfly, he's laying himself bare as well, and he opens himself up in a way that I don't think anybody had seen Goon, and it's a vulnerable moment for both of them, and neither of them know how to react to this, and so they react in the typical boy way, where they disappear from each other's lives for a little bit, not knowing exactly how to handle it. But we see that even in that separation, their love for each other slowly starts to grow, and
Mm,
it's, as we mentioned, just a very pure, youthful kind of love. And both of these boys are coming a little bit closer to normal, but not normal in the sense of just fitting in and cookie cutter, but rather a position of stability. These two boys that were anything but stable.
yeah, and it is again quite remark remarkable as we look at our way of trying to filter the world through our perceptions and our feelings, our emotions, right? Feelings are essentially a sensual thing, right? Feeling angry, and I love this about the Hebrew language, right? Feeling the word for anger has to do with your nose because it's all that heat kind of pointed at at that part of your body, and we have this as well, right? When we look at our heart and we think about love as that beating heart and what happens to us when it's when we're in danger and so on and so forth. So this sensory perception that really is a defining feature of our humanity hopefully helps us come to some more mature or maturing perspectives on how we're meant to live, not as non-emotional, robots that we're trying to attempt to become. And really, right, hasn't that been man's religious history throughout time? Right? Isn't that what the Puritan most wanted? He wanted to wear plain clothes to avoid any feeling. He wanted to measure his so that he never had an emotional response. And right, and it's interesting how unchristlike they truly became, right? Because of their desire to remove their humanity. On again on one side, and then we got on the other side the charismatic problem, where people who are running entirely by their emotion, essentially constantly shipwrecking their faiths and the faiths of others because they have no intellectual basis, there's no sense of that calm, right? So it's amazing how church history can show kind of we can relate them to these two boys as an allegory, how
Mhm.
important it is to come to a right understanding and estimation of how God designed us both to be emotional, intellectual, and volitional beings.
Yeah. Well, and I think another takeaway that I would propose is the need for fellowship.
Mm.
God did not create the spiritual life, the Christian life, to be lived in a vacuum. And while you can come to an understanding of salvation and even maturity in your relationship to God and to Christ, um, in isolation to an extent, really growing up, becoming mature, requires that iron sharpening iron, and that's what we see with these boys, iron sharpening iron, so that they're both becoming stronger. But when the center of that relationship is Christ, as we see in 1 John 4, for example, the ability to love really comes from God, and it's fine-tuned when we're able to express that towards one another. And we all have the opportunity to grow through that. And so the need for community and fellowship in the body of Christ is just so important. And if it works here in the secular world, it works so much more efficiently and effectively in the body of Christ.
Mm. Well, the book is Almond by Sohn Pyung, and you can pick it up at any bookseller. There is only one translation on the market to get. As we close, I want to let you know that our next episode will be on an amazing short story called Paper Menagerie, which is an absolutely breathtaking example of magical realism, and you can find it free online. Or is it free online?
Free online. Yeah.
Yeah, you can find it free online, which wherever you find show notes, we'll try to put links to it. It is a short read, so it's well worth reading before you get to the discussion, and I encourage you to pick up a copy today. And thank you for joining us for this discussion of Almond. Please leave any comments that you have in the comments section or send them to us in whatever way you can get a hold of us. We would love to hear future reading projects that we should do or things you'd like to take part in. And you can find us on Facebook if you're interested in seeing the full breakdown of where what we're going to be reading in the coming months.
Mhm.
So we'll see you next time.